A trail of blood to me means everything.
It seemed to be a fantastic lead if it was true.
He told Larry that he would lead him to where the money was.
It confirmed our worst nightmare.
A son vanishes without a trace, but when the cops come up empty, his parents set out on a very personal quest for justice.
Our biggest fear, I think, was that we would die without knowing what happened. I knew I could not give up.
Then, a mother disappears under mysterious circumstances, and as the trail grows colder, a daughter is forced to make a decisive decision.
I took matters into my own hands. She wasn't just another missing person. This was my mother.
What happened?
It was hard to believe. I know in my heart. Shot.
We had to find some answers.
Let it go unsolved.
Open.
Figure out who did that.
The investigation.
I needed justice.
Crucial information.
Never gonna give up.
I had to do everything I could.
Winter 1990. 21-year-old Tim Moroz seems to be on top of the world. He's working at the heart of the music scene in Portland, Oregon, at its most popular music hall, the Starry Night.
When Tim first started working at the Starry Night, he was very excited about it.
But Tim's dream is about to take a turn. On the night of January 23rd, he sets out for an important meeting with his boss.
We knew he was supposed to have a meeting with his employer, so we called to find out how everything had gone. He didn't return our calls.
According to everyone present, Tim seems fine when he leaves, but no one there ever sees him again.
We were desperately hoping that we would find some clue to Tim's disappearance.
Tim Moroz has simply vanished.
Our son was missing and we had to find him. We had to figure out what had happened.
As a first step, Mike and Penny immediately reach out to Tim's boss, Larry Hurwitz, a concert promoter and owner of the Starry Night.
Since Tim had told us that he was going to have a confrontation with his boss,
we thought maybe Larry would know where Tim was.
But when they finally get Larry on the phone, he's as baffled as they are.
Larry was concerned about Tim, too, he said.
And when Mike mentions Tim's phone call regarding trouble at work, Larry quickly explains what happened.
Larry said that he had caught Tim counterfeiting tickets to acts in the Starry Night. According to Larry, when they met, they had a confrontation. Tim broke down, admitted his role in the counterfeiting tickets, and told Larry that he would lead him to where the money was.
According to Larry, he and Tim then got in their respective cars and drove off.
And our son ran a red light and left Larry behind.
Larry said that Tim outran him and disappeared after that.
The news sends the Moroz reeling. They just can't believe that Tim, a straight-A student and former Boy Scout, would ever get involved in anything illegal.
It just didn't sit with our impression, our understanding of our son. But yet, on the other hand, we did wonder if it was possible.
Tim's journey began several years earlier while researching universities at his high school in New Orleans. After some deliberation, he ultimately chose a college in Portland, a city that seemed to have everything he was looking for.
I was concerned about Tim being so far away from home, but it was something he really wanted to do.
He loved hiking and camping out a great deal.
He had become very much aware of the music scene in Portland, so he was very excited to get a job working at the Starry Night.
Now, Mike and Penny find themselves struggling to come to terms with the fact that their oldest son may have gotten mixed up in illegal activities, and they're growing more anxious by the moment.
I was really frightened. I think Tim would have called us if he was okay.
Then, after 2 weeks with no word from Tim, the Moroz make a pivotal decision.
We decided that we need to get to Portland ourselves.
Arriving in Portland, the Moroz head directly to the police department, where a detective recounts club owner Larry Hurwitz's version of the events.
He was looked at as a disappearance case because of Tim's alleged involvement in the counterfeit ticket scam.
I remember the police officer saying he tended to believe what Larry was saying.
Mr. Hurwitz had in fact gone through several in-depth police interrogations and even passed a lie detector test. On top of that, the cops seemed to have proof that Tim has indeed left town.
The police had told us that they had found Tim's automobile at the airport parking lot. Penny and I found several counterfeited tickets sitting on his dashboard.
We were disappointed to think that our son might be involved in the ticket scam.
At this point, none of the scenarios look good for Tim, and the Moroz are praying that their son is simply on the run from the police.
I had to believe that Tim was okay. I really had to believe that he was coming home.
But they're also terrified by the possibility that Tim may have run afoul of whoever he was working with on the counterfeit ticket scam.
It was a mixture of fear and hope. Hope that Tim was okay, but also the fear that we might find out that Tim had become a victim of foul play.
The next few months are full of nothing but heartache for Mike and Penny. There's no word from Tim, no new leads, and the case seems to be growing colder and colder.
As the days passed and weeks passed, first there was Mike's birthday and we didn't hear anything. And then Mother's Day, Father's Day.
Penny and I would wake up hoping that this is the day that we would hear from Tim.
And then we wouldn't. And it was always so sad and so difficult.
But just when the Moroz think they may never find out what happened to their son, they get a call from a Portland journalist that changes everything.
The things that he told us were quite alarming.
21-year-old college student Tim Moroz has vanished without a trace, and for the past 2 months, his parents, Mike and Penny, have been struggling to find him.
It just seemed like we were at a dead end, that we would never know what happened.
The Portland police believe Tim took off after getting caught in a concert ticket scam. But the Moroz have just received a call from Portland journalist Jim Redden that could change everything.
Jim told us a lot more about Larry Hurwitz, and we were shocked.
Larry Hurwitz is the owner of the music club where Tim was working when he disappeared.
I was aware of Larry from going to shows at Starry Night. He was the most successful club owner in town, but I didn't talk to anybody that had a good thing to say about him.
The thing that shocked us the most was hearing that the police investigated Larry for an attempt to kidnap the parents of another Starry Night employee.
Sources told Jim that Hurwitz intended to blackmail the employee by holding his parents hostage, but the plan was never put into action, and although the police investigated, no criminal charges were ever filed. Now the Moroz can't help but wonder if after catching wind of the ticket scam, Hurwitz simply took matters into his own hands.
Both Penny and I were quite fearful for what might have happened to Tim and fearful of our own safety.
But none of it is adding up. Hurwitz already passed a lie detector test, and if he had evidence that Tim was ripping off the club, why not take it directly to the police? Still, Penny and Mike can't shake off the feeling that Hurwitz knows more than he's letting on.
We went to the police with Jim's story. The police were not totally convinced that Tim was the victim of foul play. I think they still felt that he was probably missing.
I think that it was now approaching the point of becoming a cold case file, the police saying without additional evidence, there's nothing more they can do.
But that's not good enough for Mike and Penny. Desperate to find their son, they decide to take the initiative themselves.
I remembered subscribing to the local newspapers in Portland, Oregon, and Penny would clip out any notice of the discovery of any unidentified body.
I would send those to the police officer just to make sure it wasn't Tim.
Our biggest fear, I think, was that we would have to go through life and die without knowing what happened to Tim. I knew that I could not give up.
Months go by without a clue. Then, nearly half a year after Tim's disappearance, there's a surprising new development. Jim Redden publishes a story accusing Larry Hurwitz of counterfeiting tickets and other illegal activities. The revelation that Hurwitz himself may have been behind the ticket scam is a watershed moment.
It was beginning to look like, well, Larry knew more than he was telling us.
Still, it raises more questions than answers. If Hurwitz was the one running the counterfeiting operation, why would Tim have gone missing?
The police wondered whether or not Larry had paid off Tim to disappear, take the rap for the counterfeiting tickets.
But Hurwitz is owning up to none of it. He in turn contends that performers boycotted the Starry Night as a result of the article, and soon files suit against the paper for libel.
Larry claimed that the story was false, that it caused him great financial harm.
But in preparing his libel case, Hurwitz inadvertently makes a damaging disclosure.
We requested all of his financial records because he was claiming that we had hurt him financially. Larry had not filed his income taxes for 4 years, and then he filed them all at once on the same day, and we got copies of those. And it was obvious that they were false filings, that there was no documentation for the deductions he was claiming.
The lawsuit is quickly dismissed, but the documents are made public, and suddenly, the Moroz see an opportunity. If they can prove that Hurwitz was engaged in some type of illegal activity, maybe they can compel him or someone in his inner circle to come clean about Tim's disappearance.
We went through a fine-tooth comb. When we concluded that he was probably making more money than he was reporting on his income taxes, we saw to it that the IRS got that information.
The IRS was very much interested in pursuing the case.
But these cases can take years to build, so they wait. Meanwhile, back in Portland, there's another startling development.
The police called.
They said that they had an informant.
He indicated he knew how Tim had been murdered. He had been killed, and then his body weighted down with microphone stands and put in the Willamette River. It was very hard to hear. It confirmed our worst nightmare.
I think they searched for about 4 or 5 hours.
It was an unusual scene because my husband and I were standing there while the divers were going into the river, and they were looking for our son's body. It was just unbearable.
They were not able to find any remains, so it was another lost hope.
It soon becomes clear that the informant was lying in the hope of getting a relative out of jail. But the Portland police now agree with Penny and Mike that their son may have been the victim of foul play. Without evidence or a body, however, there's not much they can do.
93 to 97 were really, really hard years for me personally. I became very depressed, and at one point I stopped work, and I kept looking for signs or something that would help me know what had happened to Tim.
We had made a promise when Tim disappeared that we would not stop until we found out what happened to Tim. And we still had to fight because we still didn't know for sure whether or not we would ever see justice.
Mike and Penny Moroz have been searching tirelessly for their missing son Tim for 8 long years.
We would not give up in our quest to find out what happened to our son.
Finally, their persistence pays off. For years, they've suspected that Tim's former boss knew more than he was saying, and in 1998, they learned that he's been arrested for income tax evasion.
Larry was not well liked, and there was some fear of him. And so we hoped that once he was behind bars, people who might have information might come forward.
Hurwitz is convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison, and just as they hoped, a witness soon materializes.
the homicide detectives said there was a female informant who had critical information about what happened to our son.
She knew someone who witnessed a murder of Tim Moroz.
And what she claims to know is a bombshell. The witness tells police that Tim was murdered by none other than Larry Hurwitz himself.
We had some emotional relief, but also a lot of anger that it had taken so long and so many lies told to us to lead us in wild goose chases.
I was just really, really angry. We had to see that they would go to prison.
But there's a problem that only Mike and Penny can solve. Tim is still officially a missing person, and without a body or a declaration of death, they can't pursue a murder indictment against Hurwitz.
The Portland police went to Mike and Penny Moroz to get a judgment of death.
Without much hesitation, we said we would if it's going to help us find out what happened to Tim.
Mike and Penny muster their courage and head to court to present their case in front of a judge in a public hearing.
I had to explain to a judge about parents who would like to declare their own son dead without having a body. And I can still hear the judge saying that he had thereby declared Tim dead.
We walked out of the courtroom and just hugged each other and cried.
Now armed with Tim's declaration of death and the female witness's testimony, the Portland police begin methodically building a case against Hurwitz. As the investigation proceeds, it becomes clear that Tim was the victim of an organized plot involving an accomplice, longtime Starry Night employee, George Castagnola.
The interview with the witness ultimately led to George Castagnola, who then, when apprehended, confessed to his knowledge and involvement in the crime. He named Larry as the one who he was involved with in murdering Tim Moroz.
Castagnola also confirms that Hurwitz himself was in fact the one behind the ticket counterfeiting scheme all along. And after nearly a decade of second guessing, the mystery as to why Tim was killed is finally revealed. As it turns out, Tim was about to blow the whistle on the entire operation.
I think that Larry Hurwitz was afraid that Tim Moroz would expose his involvement in this illegal ticket scheme, and so that was obviously the reason that they chose to silence him.
Under pressure, eyewitness Castagnola provides the police with a detailed confession about what really happened the day Tim Moroz went missing. It's the moment Mike and Penny have waited years for, but that doesn't make it any easier.
It was so painful to hear how they premeditated the murder and carried it out in such a brutal fashion.
Larry did in fact invite Tim Moroz to Starry Night under the pretense of trying to resolve this counterfeit ticket scheme. At that point, Larry had already decided he was going to murder Tim, and that Larry had dug a grave in the state of Washington where he was going to bury the body.
They left the office and walked down the hall.
At some point, George struck Tim in the stomach, which caused him to lean forward.
Then Larry took a garrote made out of microphone wire and broom handles and put it over Tim's neck and strangled him.
It was extremely violent. Tim fought very hard against this.
And Larry had yelled at George to grab his feet because Tim was struggling to stay alive.
And while he was strangling him, the homemade garrote broke. But by that time, Tim was unconscious.
They weren't sure he was dead. So then they took duct tape and wrapped his face in duct tape to make sure he was dead, and put his body in garbage bags in the trunk of a car and drove him to the grave.
Then, according to the confession, Castagnola took Tim's car, parked it at the airport, and planted the counterfeit tickets on the dashboard.
The justice system felt like they finally had the story right and that they could finally indict Larry.
Mike and Penny may have learned the painful truth of what happened to their son, but their quest for justice won't be over until Hurwitz is convicted of the horrendous crime and they discover what the killers have done with Tim's body.
I was just angry. I don't think I could get in touch with the sadness at that point. We had waited so long and worked so hard, and then we knew that wasn't the end.
After 10 grueling years, 17 trips to Portland, and hundreds of phone calls, Mike and Penny Moroz are on the verge of seeing the man who murdered their son, club owner Larry Hurwitz, brought to justice. But right before the trial is about to start, they're robbed of the chance to see a jury convict him.
Well, Larry pled no contest to the homicide, showed absolutely no remorse, and denied involvement in the homicide.
Hurwitz's plea earns him a 12-year sentence for murder, but he refuses to confess. And despite a police-led search along the Columbia River Gorge, Tim's body is never found. It's a bittersweet moment for the Moroz, but they can take solace in one thing. Without their undying commitment to solving the case, Hurwitz would never have been brought to justice.
We had a case that we thought was never going to be solved, and it looked like some people were going to get away with murder.
Mike and Penny's involvement is what actually brought George Castagnola and Larry Hurwitz to justice. Without their involvement, their tenacity, their relentless pursuit of justice, I don't think the case would have been solved.
We saw some justice. I could live with the fact, I thought, that we did not have Tim's remains, but I still find that difficult. I'm glad about all that we did, but I still wish Tim were here.
We can't express the tremendous desire that we could ever speak to our son again. I think I would tell Tim, as I reflect back on the promise that Penny and I made to each other, and to think about where your body is buried somewhere along the beautiful Columbia River Gorge, I'm reminded of the words by Robert Frost in his poem, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep."
Mike and Penny have to live with the reality that Tim's final resting place may never be found. But sometimes, discovering a lost loved one can be an even more harrowing experience. Tuesday, August 13th, 1991. It's an eerily quiet morning at the home of Bill and Pearl Bruns in South Portland, Maine. The Brunses should be busy getting ready for work by now, but the house is completely empty, and both Bill and Pearl are nowhere to be found. 40 miles away, 22-year-old Elaine Woodward is beginning to worry. She hasn't heard from her mother, Pearl, in 2 days.
I usually spoke to my mother at least one time a day. It was very unusual not hearing from her. I started getting real concerned.
Her first call is to the person closest to Pearl, her husband, Bill Bruns. But Elaine is unable to reach her stepfather either. Still, she tells herself there must be some logical explanation.
Bill owned a delivery service for lobsters and fish, so it wasn't uncommon for her to jump in the truck sometimes and go deliver with him.
Elaine waits patiently for someone to get back to her. But as the hours pass, her concern grows, and eventually she decides to head over to her mother's house.
As soon as I pulled up, I noticed her Cadillac in the driveway. So I thought, oh, she must be home. But when I went inside, it was obvious that she hadn't been there since Sunday. She got a paper every day, and the last paper that was there was Sunday.
At first, nothing in the house seems out of the ordinary, but as Elaine walks toward the master bedroom at the end of the hall, she notices a half-packed suitcase on the floor, and then something strange.
I noticed my mother's pinky ring was on the corner of the bureau. I was confused. I knew she wouldn't take the ring off.
Elaine immediately calls the police. And South Portland Police Detective Linda Barker is the first investigator on the scene.
When I got there, we walked through the small dining area, the living room.
But it's in the powder room that Detective Barker first spots something curious.
There were a couple of droplets of blood over in the sink area, and I pointed those out to Elaine.
On that Sunday, my mother was trying to open a jar, and she had cut her finger. I told Detective Barker that my mother had high blood pressure and that, when she did get cut, she did bleed very easily.
But Detective Barker soon makes another unsettling discovery.
I went into the bedroom, and a suitcase looked like it was either hastily packed or it had been rifled through. There appeared to be some kind of splattering, maybe dried blood, on the outside of the suitcase.
However, the blood appears to be present in very small amounts, and to Elaine seems explainable.
And Elaine said, well, her mother had nosebleeds, and that was probably it. So every time I pointed out these little droplets of blood, Elaine discounted them.
Still, nothing they find in the house gets them any closer to the central question. Where are Bill and Pearl Bruns?
She asked me, is there any conceivable place that you haven't searched? I said, the crawl space under the home.
When I opened up the bulkhead that led down to the basement area, I noted that there appeared to be, again, dried blood droplets leading down the stairs.
That's when I really started panicking.
I could not see anybody at the bottom of the stairs, which was my first concern.
Realizing the potential danger of the situation, Detective Barker calls for backup.
When they went down inside the basement with the shovels, I was terrified. I thought they were going to come back up and tell me they had found my mother down there.
Elaine Woodward's 47-year-old mother, Pearl, and her husband, Bill, have been missing for more than 2 days.
I still hadn't heard from her. I had called my aunts, I had called her friends, and I still hadn't heard from Bill. I just kept telling myself I'm going to hear from her. But deep in my heart, I worried I'd never hear from her again.
South Portland detective Linda Barker has discovered a trail of blood leading to Pearl's basement. Now, joined by a second officer, Linda descends the dark stairs.
There was no lights. It was just a crawl space with dirt. We brought flashlights and shovels, and we did dig around a little bit.
But after 15 nerve-wracking minutes, Detective Barker emerges from the basement, empty-handed.
We couldn't find where there was any real disruption of the soil, and we had no evidence that there was anybody buried there.
Unable to search any further without a warrant, the two detectives depart, leaving Elaine in a state of total confusion.
I didn't feel any relief at all because I still had all the unanswered questions, about where my mother was and whether my mother was alive or dead.
Elaine files a missing persons report. Then, a day later, her hopes are revived when she finally hears from her stepfather, Bill Bruns. As it turns out, he was on the road making deliveries. Bruns confirms the story about Pearl cutting herself on the jar, and he doesn't think there's anything to worry about.
He said, "Why'd you report her missing? Your mother, she takes off all the time."
That was a theme that we heard over and over again. Bill said that his wife often just took off. He was asked about when was the last time she was seen, what was her demeanor, what was she wearing, and he was cooperative.
He's like, "Oh, just give it some time. We'll hear from her."
After all, it wouldn't be the first time Elaine's mother had disappeared.
My mother drank quite heavily, and whenever she wanted to get away, she'd go to one of my aunt's houses and stay the night.
The hard-drinking 47-year-old had led a decidedly colorful life, marrying and divorcing a number of men over the years.
I'm trying to think how many times. She was married once before my father, then my father, Sherm, Gordon, Chester, Bill. So what am I up to? 6?
But through the roller coaster ride of Pearl's many marriages, one relationship has remained strong and constant, the one with her daughter.
My mother was a very sweet, giving, caring person. She'd give her shirt off her back to anybody. We used to always sit on the couch together. I'd lay with my head in her lap, and she'd just run her fingers through my hair as we watched TV. I never got too old for it.
Elaine doesn't believe her mother would have run off without telling her first, and the blood droplets and half-packed suitcase are more than suspicious. But given her history and no other evidence of foul play, police can only continue to investigate the missing persons case.
We immediately began calling the buses, the airlines, taxi cabs, any form of transportation out of town. We couldn't find that she had left town in any of the normal ways.
I kept contacting the South Portland police, and they told me there was no new developments. I got very frustrated. I wanted answers. That's when I took matters into my own hands.
In the weeks following her mother's disappearance, Elaine spends hours contacting everyone who knew her mother, looking for anything that might shed light on her disappearance.
I spoke to aunts and uncles and my mother's friends and people at the VFW. I went around to the places that she went, asking about her.
But no one has seen Pearl since the day she went missing.
Every waking moment I had was devoted to trying to get the answers about what happened to my mother, and that's all that mattered to me.
After several weeks of nothing but dead ends, Elaine realizes she needs help. So she begins contacting local newspapers, hoping that someone will be interested in writing about her mother's mysterious disappearance.
I got a lot of people that were not even interested. They kept saying she's just another missing person. But she wasn't just another missing person. You know, this was my mother.
But when Elaine reaches out to local TV reporter Christine Young, her luck begins to change.
When Elaine told me the story, I kind of thought that it was more than just a missing persons case, that her mother was a victim of foul play.
In late August, Christine produces the first news segment about Pearl's disappearance. And within hours, the police are overwhelmed with calls from citizens who think they've seen Pearl.
The South Portland police told me that there had been spottings of my mother walking around and different things where someone had said that they had seen her. They told me that they investigated those leads and they didn't turn anything up.
Then, just a few days later, TV reporter Christine Young gets a call from an old friend of Pearl's that changes everything.
My mother's friend told her that my mother had always said that if anything ever happened to her, to let everybody know that Bill had done it. I believed the worst at that point.
Elaine has no idea why Bruns would want to harm her mother, but she's now convinced that he knows more than he's letting on. Still, Linda Barker and the police investigators are less certain.
We did interview Bill about his whereabouts that evening. He recounted the various places that he'd been. When we checked up on that, it appeared that he had indeed done all those things.
But then, in September 1991, there's a discovery that threatens to turn the entire investigation on its head.
The South Portland police called me and informed me that they had found my mother's purse in New Hampshire. It had ID in it, and on the outside of the purse was what appeared to be blood droplets.
New Hampshire police and a horde of local volunteers fan out to search the wintry woods.
At that point, I knew they weren't going to find my mother. They were just going to find my mother's body.
For 7 weeks, Elaine Woodward has held out hope that her missing mother, Pearl Bruns, is still alive. But when Pearl's bloody purse is discovered in a New Hampshire forest, Elaine's worst nightmare appears to be coming true.
I just remember just crying for hours. I knew I'd never hear from her again.
After an exhaustive search of the surrounding area, police turn up no new clues.
I was elated that they didn't find her body, but at the same time, I was irritated because I wanted closure.
The bloody purse also raises troubling new questions. If Bill Bruns had something to do with his wife's disappearance, why would her purse be in New Hampshire? Could it be that she left town after all, then ran into trouble she wasn't expecting?
There was another murder that had taken place not too far from where that purse was found. So that kind of made people think, well, you know, maybe this other killer had also killed Pearl.
Frustrated and confused, Elaine once again turns to local reporter Christine Young.
At one point, Elaine called me, and she was just at wit's end. She'd tried everything, she'd written to everybody, and she felt like the case was just kind of dying. And I said, you know what? I think I've got a connection.
Christine contacts a friend at the Maine Attorney General's office and lays out the case.
That immediately sounded alarms for him. And that's when something finally happened.
2 to 3 weeks later, the Maine State Police had taken over my mother's investigation. I was so happy. I felt that we were going to start making some headway.
Detective Mike Harriman is brought in to supervise a team of investigators assigned to the case.
After initial review of the evidence, Bill Bruns became a suspect in a possible homicide of his wife.
As a first step, the state police obtain a search warrant and decide to test the Bruns home with luminol, a chemical that detects and illuminates trace amounts of blood at crime scenes.
Well, we felt that testing with luminol might be helpful to us because coming into a case at such a late stage in the investigation, that the possibility of the blood being cleaned up was obviously there.
As technicians apply the luminol to the Bruns home, the results are immediate and staggering.
There was certainly blood in the linoleum floor. There was blood on the walls. There was blood soaked through the carpeting in the home.
The amount of blood that they found, I knew there's no way my mother could still be alive.
The police confront Bill Bruns with the evidence, but once again, he denies everything.
Do we look like morons?
Of course not.
Well, for Christ's sakes, when you walk into that house, if you don't see the blood on the rugs, and you don't see the blood on everything else in there, there's something wrong with it.
His indication to us was that he simply would not hurt Pearl. He could not explain why blood would have been there.
Elaine can't believe what she's hearing, but the police promise her they will not give up.
They told me, we're gonna catch him. He's gonna make a mistake, we're gonna catch him.
But without a confession or a body, the police are at a standstill. Mike Harriman, however, has one more trick up his sleeve. He decides to obtain another search warrant, but this time they go back down the stairs where Elaine and Detective Barker saw traces of blood so many months ago.
We knew that we needed to further evaluate that basement to be sure, one way or the other, whether her remains were located there. We felt that we could survey it with ground-penetrating radar.
Ground-penetrating radar uses radio waves to detect voids, cracks, abnormalities, and objects buried beneath the ground's surface. If Pearl's body is in the basement, the radar will find it.
The technicians used the radar to do a complete search of the basement.
The gentleman that was working the machine said, well, I see a pattern disruptive in the ground right here.
It was within just a few shovelfuls that we struck a plastic bag.
13 months to the day from her disappearance, Pearl Bruns' body is found in the basement of her own home.
There's so many emotions that you can't even describe them all. I lost my best friend. My mother was everything to me. I've got 2 other children that my mother never got to know. Those children will never know their grandmother.
As the medical examiner removes Pearl's body from the shallow grave, Elaine's stepfather, Bill Bruns, is having lunch upstairs.
He was in the kitchen eating spaghetti and meatballs.
They told him, hey, Bill, guess what? We found Pearl in the basement, and you're under arrest for the murder of your wife.
Elaine's quest for personal justice is over, but the victory is bittersweet. Bruns accepts a manslaughter plea at the last minute. In return, he gets 15 years, but doesn't have to explain what unfolded on that fateful day.
If I had to guess what occurred that night, I would say an argument, possibly about money.
It appears certainly that there was an altercation that occurred in the home.
At some point, he struck her during the argument and broke part of her cheekbone.
The medical examiner indicated that the blows to the face did fracture the orbit of her eye, some cheekbone, and that it caused certainly bleeding from the face area.
She bled internally and drowned.
I have terrible nightmares thinking that he could just stand there and watch my mother bleed.
I think that when he struck her, he left enraged. And when he came back, he found that Pearl had died. And at that point, I think he panicked and proceeded to cover up the crime.
From that point, the body was transported to the basement, where it was ultimately buried.
Lastly, there's the question of the pocketbook found in the New Hampshire woods.
Well, I think that the pocketbook being placed was done by Bill to cover up what was going on.
Pearl could have remained buried in the basement forever, were it not for her daughter's heroic quest for answers.
Elaine, being persistent and seeing that the investigation moved along, was instrumental in finally solving this case.
I admire Elaine. Nothing stopped her. She was determined to find out what happened to her mother, and ultimately she did.
I think my mother would have been proud with the way I handled things, not giving up. I'm happy that I was able to put her to rest.
Bill Bruns served his sentence and was released after 9 years for good behavior. He is currently on parole and living back in southern Maine. Elaine now lives in Florida with her family. She often tells her children about the grandmother they never got to know. And when her grief becomes too much to bear, she remembers the last day she saw her mother alive.
We sat around and visited. I gave my mother a manicure. I gave her a hug and kiss, and that was the last time I seen her. The last thing I said before I left was, "I love you." So I've got that.